A billionaire believed abandoning his pregnant wife was a private decision, one the world would never see. But the body remembers what silence hides, and systems remember what power ignores. When she collapsed and was taken to the hospital, the truth didn't scream. It documented itself. By morning, his control was gone, and the truth was permanent. The storm arrived as if summoned, rolling across the elite districts of the city with a force that rattled iron gates and turned polished streets into mirrors of chaos. In neighborhoods where wealth insulated residents from most forms of discomfort, the rain felt unusually intrusive, relentless, almost accusatory. Behind one such gate stood the Caldwell estate, a symbol of control and permanence, designed to project order no matter what unfolded beyond its walls. Inside that fortress lived Ethan Caldwell, a self-made billionaire whose name was synonymous with discipline, restraint, and strategic generosity. To the public, he was admired for his calculated success and his visible commitment to philanthropy, a man who appeared to have mastered both power and principle. Privately, Ethan's world functioned by a colder logic. Every aspect of his life was governed by precision, including his relationships. Emotional warmth was not something he cultivated. It was something he tolerated only when it aligned with his objectives. His marriage to Olivia existed within that same framework. She was his wife in title, yet her presence in his life was managed rather than embraced. Over time, the mansion that once symbolized security became a structure of quiet dominance, where silence replaced intimacy and control stood in for care. Olivia's pregnancy had intensified that imbalance. Rather than bringing connection, it introduced tension that Ethan neither welcomed nor disguised. He saw the pregnancy as a complication, a visible reminder that not everything could be engineered or contained. To him, it threatened the image he guarded obsessively, an image built on perfection and predictability. Olivia sensed this shift long before the storm clouds gathered. Her emotional isolation deepened, and the sense that she had become an inconvenience rather than a partner settled heavily over her days. The night of the storm marked the point where unspoken fractures became irreversible. Rain hammered against the windows as Ethan moved through the mansion with deliberate calm. There was no outburst, no raised voice, no visible loss of control. His decision was methodical, formed from the same mindset he applied to business setbacks. Olivia's presence, he concluded, disrupted the order he demanded. Removing her from the environment felt, to him, like a corrective action rather than an act of cruelty. The contrast between the world outside and the world within sharpened the moment. Security systems hummed quietly, guarding priceless objects and reinforcing the power imbalance that defined their marriage. Olivia stood vulnerable within that protected space, carrying a child and the weight of uncertainty, while Ethan remained insulated by wealth and authority. When he directed her toward the door, the act carried a finality that echoed louder than the thunder outside. This was not an impulsive rejection. It was a calculated severance. As the gates opened and the rain rushed in, the symbolism became unavoidable. The storm mirrored the moral collapse unfolding behind closed doors. Ethan watched as Olivia stepped beyond the threshold, convinced that distance would resolve the issue. In his mind, the night offered erasure. The rain would blur details, the darkness would swallow consequences, and morning would restore control. He underestimated the permanence of what he had done. Outside the estate, the city felt indifferent and vast. Olivia's isolation was immediate and absolute, magnified by the weather and the realization that her dependency had been engineered over years. The power imbalance that defined her marriage now defined her survival. She was separated from security, resources, and the illusion of protection in a matter of moments. Ethan, meanwhile, retreated into the mansion, certain that his status insulated him from accountability. From an omniscient perspective, the cruelty of the act stood in stark contrast to Ethan's cultivated image. A man praised for discipline had exercised dominance without conscience. A figure admired for generosity had chosen abandonment. The audience is forced to confront an uncomfortable question. How does someone with limitless resources justify such deliberate coldness? The answer lay not in the storm or the circumstances, but in a worldview where control outweighed compassion. The decision fractured more than a marriage. It exposed the limits of wealth as a shield against moral consequence. Ethan believed he had contained a problem, yet he failed to recognize that systems built for efficiency also preserve records. Every action leaves a trace, even those taken under the cover of darkness. The night did not erase his choice. It preserved it. As Olivia disappeared into the rain-soaked streets with nowhere to turn, Ethan closed the doors behind him, convinced that silence would follow. He did not see the chain of events beginning to form beyond his walls, nor did he understand what appeared to the outside world as an immaculate billionaire marriage had been engineered with the same precision Ethan Caldwell applied to his businesses. From the beginning, the union was defined less by affection and more by alignment. Ethan did not enter relationships seeking emotional reciprocity. He sought compatibility with his vision of order. Olivia fit that vision in ways that were immediately advantageous. She was composed, intelligent, and adaptable, capable of enhancing the image Ethan cultivated so carefully. Their early years were marked by polish and appearances, a life that photographed well and reassured investors, peers, and social circles alike. Behind closed doors, however, the marriage followed a different logic. Wealth did not function as a shared foundation but as a mechanism of control. Every privilege Olivia enjoyed was tied to systems Ethan oversaw, from finances to scheduling to access. What looked like abundance gradually became a form of quiet containment. Independence dissolved not through confrontation, but through convenience. Decisions were made on her behalf under the guise of efficiency, and resistance was subtly reframed as unnecessary disruption. Over time, Olivia's role shifted from partner to dependent, her autonomy eroded by a structure that rewarded compliance. Ethan's obsession with legacy intensified this imbalance. He believed deeply in control not only of outcomes but of narratives. His fixation on genetic perfection and reputation shaped the expectations he imposed on his marriage. Olivia was expected to embody stability and continuity, to fit seamlessly into a life curated for permanence. Emotional needs were deprioritized, treated as secondary to the preservation of order. In Ethan's worldview, love was unreliable, but control was measurable. That belief governed how he interacted with his wife, gradually reducing her presence to a function within his broader design. As the years progressed, Olivia's emotional voice grew faint. There were no dramatic confrontations, no moments that outsiders could easily identify as breaking points. Instead, there was a steady narrowing of choice. Social engagements were filtered, friendships drifted away, and personal preferences were quietly overridden. Ethan framed these changes as protection, as necessary adjustments to a high-profile life. Olivia learned that peace came from acquiescence, and that asserting herself invited distance. The marriage settled into a pattern of silence punctuated by expectation. The pregnancy disrupted this fragile equilibrium in ways Ethan could not fully control. For Olivia, it represented possibility, a chance to reclaim meaning beyond the confines of her role. For Ethan, it introduced unpredictability. Pregnancy altered timelines, introduced vulnerability, and risked public scrutiny. Rather than bringing them closer, it exposed the emotional emptiness at the heart of their marriage. Ethan's detachment deepened, and Olivia felt the shift acutely. The home that once promised stability now felt conditional, its warmth dependent on her ability to remain unobtrusive. Subtle warning signs appeared during this period, though few chose to see them. Olivia's presence at public events diminished, her once visible confidence replaced by careful restraint. Staff members noticed her isolation, the way decisions were deferred upward rather than discussed. Medical appointments became tightly managed, schedules optimized to minimize disruption. Yet society overlooked these indicators. Ethan's status shielded him from scrutiny, and the absence of visible conflict was mistaken for harmony. Emotional neglect, lacking spectacle, remained invisible to those who equated wealth with well-being. From an omniscient perspective, the marriage revealed itself as transactional. Stability was exchanged for silence, luxury for compliance. Emotional needs were deferred indefinitely, framed as inconveniences rather than necessities. Olivia's existence within the marriage was conditional, valued only insofar as it supported Ethan's sense of control. The lack of physical violence did not equate to safety. It concealed a systemic form of harm rooted in power imbalance. Control was exercised through structure, not force, making it easier to ignore and harder to challenge. As Olivia adapted to this reality, a quiet record began to form around her. Medical observations noted elevated stress markers, patterns of fatigue, and signs of emotional strain. Administrative systems logged appointments, changes, and anomalies without interpretation or judgment. Ethan believed that dominance ensured invisibility, that authority erased traces of dissent. He failed to recognize that systems designed for efficiency also preserve data. The same mechanisms that reinforced his control quietly documented its consequences. By the time the storm arrived at the Caldwell estate, the marriage had already collapsed internally. The rain did not create the fracture. It merely illuminated it. What Ethan perceived as order was, in truth, a brittle construct sustained by silence and dependency. Olivia stood at the edge of a life defined by control, carrying both the weight of pregnancy and the realization that the structure surrounding her was not built for care. What Ethan never anticipated was that the very system he built to control Olivia had already started recording evidence against him. As the storm intensified, the danger was no longer confined to emotion or consequence. It became physical, measurable, and quietly urgent. The rain fell with a density that flattened sound and blurred distance, transforming the city into a maze of reflections and uncertainty. For Olivia, each step away from the Caldwell estate carried a new weight. The night air pressed against her chest, heavy with moisture and cold, and the stress she had carried for months began to surface in ways she could no longer ignore. The body, unlike the mind, did not negotiate with denial. Her pace slowed as the city revealed its indifference. This was a place built to absorb movement, not suffering. Cars passed without pause, storefronts glowed without invitation, and sidewalks offered no acknowledgement. Without status or protection, vulnerability dissolved into the background noise of rain. Olivia's breath grew shallow, her balance uncertain, as the physical cost of abandonment replaced the abstract fear she had felt inside the mansion. What had once been emotional neglect now translated into immediate risk. The pregnancy amplified every sensation. Subtle discomforts she had dismissed earlier became signals she could not silence. A tightening in her abdomen, a dizziness that lingered longer than expected, a fatigue that felt disproportionate to the distance she had walked. These were not dramatic warnings, but they accumulated with intention, foreshadowing complications that thrived under stress and exposure. The storm seemed to conspire with her exhaustion, each gust of wind pushing against resolve already stretched thin. Darkness and rain worked together as cinematic pressure, narrowing her world to what lay directly in front of her. Streetlights fractured into halos on the pavement, offering visibility without guidance. The city's scale dwarfed her, making her feel smaller with every block. The absence of shelter became its own form of threat. This was not a dramatic chase or a sudden calamity. It was the slow, relentless erosion of stability, where survival depended on endurance rather than action. As minutes passed, the cost of Ethan's decision revealed itself with clarity. Abandonment was no longer an abstract cruelty. It was a life-threatening calculation. Olivia's body responded to stress with quiet defiance, signaling limits she could not override. The rain soaked through her clothes, drawing warmth away and replacing it with a persistent chill. Her thoughts narrowed, focused less on where she was going and more on staying upright. Each pause became longer, each breath more deliberate. The city remained unmoved. No one intervened, not out of malice, but out of habit. In a place accustomed to motion, stillness went unnoticed. Olivia's emotional isolation reached its absolute lowest point as the realization settled that survival, in this moment, rested entirely on her ability to endure. The systems that had once enclosed her now felt distant and unreachable, and the illusion of protection they offered dissolved completely. Her collapse did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded as a gradual surrender to gravity, a moment when the body asserted authority over will. Knees buckled, balance failed, and the rain closed in, indifferent to the shift. The street did not react. It absorbed the moment as it absorbed everything else, washing it into the night. For a brief interval, Olivia existed between awareness and absence, the sound of rain filling the space where certainty had been. From an omniscient view, the significance of the moment extended beyond the pavement. This was the point where private cruelty intersected with public systems. The street was not equipped to judge or intervene. It offered neither mercy nor malice. What mattered was not where Olivia fell, but where she would be taken. The decision that would shape the outcome was no longer Ethan's to make, nor the city's to ignore. When help arrived, it did not come with recognition or reverence. It came with procedure, efficiency, and neutrality. The transition from street to vehicle marked a shift from indifference to protocol, from anonymity to documentation. The rain continued to fall, but its role diminished as Olivia was moved into a space governed by rules rather than chance. The danger remained, but it changed form, becoming something that could be measured, assessed, and addressed. As the vehicle moved through the city, the storm faded into background noise, replaced by the controlled urgency of a system designed to respond. Olivia's condition, once invisible, became observable. Stress, exposure, and pregnancy intersected in ways that demanded attention. The emotional narrative receded as the physical reality took precedence, setting the stage for revelations that would not remain contained within medical walls. When Olivia collapsed, it was not the street that would decide her fate. It was the hospital that would uncover the truth. Inside the emergency room, time compressed into fragments measured by breath, pulse, and protocol. The automatic doors closed behind Olivia as the storm was left outside, its chaos replaced by fluorescent light and procedural calm. Here, status dissolved quickly. Names, titles, and wealth did not dictate urgency. Symptoms did. The triage process moved with practiced efficiency, translating visible distress into clinical priorities. What mattered was not who she was married to, but what her body was communicating under strain. Medical urgency overrode every external narrative. Vital signs were taken, histories requested, and observations recorded without assumption or deference. Stress markers were elevated, dehydration evident, and the pregnancy introduced layers of complexity that demanded careful coordination. The emergency room functioned as a neutral arena, where authority yielded to evidence and outcomes depended on accuracy. Olivia was no longer an invisible figure moving through the city. She became a patient whose condition required immediate attention. As her information entered the system, hospital databases did what they were designed to do. They connected data points, cross-referenced histories, and flagged patterns. This process was silent and impartial, indifferent to intention. Ethan Caldwell's name appeared not as a symbol of power, but as a data entry linked to prior records. The appearance was subtle, a line in a protected system that prompted verification rather than alarm. Yet its presence altered the trajectory of the night. Doctors and staff acted as observers of truth rather than participants in drama. Their role was not to judge but to interpret, to assemble meaning from numbers, notes, and timing. Olivia's condition raised questions that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Elevated stress levels aligned too closely with documented patterns, and the timeline suggested prolonged exposure to factors known to complicate pregnancy. These were not accusations. They were observations demanding explanation. Institutional ethics guided the response. Hospitals were structured to protect patients, not reputations. Influence carried no weight against documentation, and discretion did not mean silence. The system required consistency, transparency, and escalation when anomalies appeared. As records were reviewed, early hints emerged that Olivia's condition was not solely the result of a single night's exposure. The data suggested a progression, a buildup of strain that had been present long before the rain. Each decision made in the emergency room reinforced the shift from private control to public accountability. Monitoring intensified, consultations expanded, and documentation deepened. The pregnancy necessitated careful evaluation, and every step was recorded with precision. What had once been confined to a controlled environment now unfolded within an institution designed to preserve truth. The neutrality of the process was its greatest threat to secrecy. From an omniscient perspective, the significance of the moment extended beyond medical care. The emergency room represented a boundary Ethan could not cross. His influence, effective in curated spaces, held no authority here. Protocol dictated actions, and ethics ensured consistency. The system did not act against him. It simply acted for Olivia. That distinction proved critical. As clinicians reviewed histories, subtle inconsistencies surfaced. Appointments that aligned too neatly, stress indicators that recurred without resolution, patterns that suggested management rather than care. None of it pointed to spectacle, but together it formed a narrative that demanded attention. The hospital's role was not to speculate, but to document, and documentation, once created, carried permanence. Olivia remained unaware of the broader implications unfolding around her. Her focus narrowed to breathing, to the reassurance of monitored stability. The environment, though clinical, offered a form of safety she had not felt in months. Decisions were made with her well-being as the sole priority, free from negotiation or expectation. In that space, her vulnerability became acknowledged rather than dismissed. The emergency room continued its rhythm, efficient and unyielding. Files were updated, consultations logged, and alerts generated according to policy. One particular record drew closer scrutiny, not because it was dramatic, but because it did not align. Dates, notes, and observations formed a sequence that resisted simplification. It suggested intent where chance was expected, pattern where randomness should have prevailed. One file, opened without bias, revealed inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. The hospital did not uncover rumors. It uncovered patterns. In the quiet efficiency of secured databases, fragments of information aligned with a precision no individual could manipulate. Records spoke without emotion, yet their collective weight carried consequence. What emerged was not a single anomaly but a sequence, a history that resisted dismissal. The truth did not announce itself loudly. It assembled patiently, line by line, note by note, until it formed a narrative independent of influence. As clinicians and administrators reviewed Olivia's file, prior encounters surfaced with unexpected clarity. Dates matched stress markers. Observations repeated across visits that had once seemed routine now revealed continuity. Elevated blood pressure recorded during earlier checkups, notes about anxiety responses during controlled consultations, recommendations that were acknowledged but never followed through to resolution. None of these entries were dramatic on their own. Together, they suggested something else entirely. A long-standing condition managed for appearance rather than health. The records documented more than physiology. They reflected decision-making pathways, approvals, deferrals, and patterns of consent that appeared overly centralized. Appointment scheduling clustered tightly around availability windows that prioritized efficiency over recovery. Specialist referrals were noted, then postponed. Follow-ups were logged, then quietly redirected. The system captured these choices without judgment, yet the accumulation hinted at a consistent objective. Care was administered to maintain stability, not to address cause. Psychological indicators appeared in the margins, understated yet persistent. Notes referenced heightened stress responses inconsistent with reported home environments. Screening tools flagged risk factors that were acknowledged but minimized. The language remained professional, careful, restrained. No accusations were made, but the repetition itself became significant. Emotional strain was present across multiple contexts, suggesting an environment that exerted pressure rather than support. Pregnancy-related risk factors, once isolated, now aligned with this broader pattern. Recommendations for reduced stress were recorded alongside evidence that such guidance was not implemented. Lifestyle adjustments were noted as advised, then documented as unachieved. The records did not speculate on motive, they traced outcomes. The result was a medical profile that pointed to chronic exposure rather than isolated incident. The storm had aggravated a condition already in motion. As the review deepened, the limits of power became evident. Documentation did not bend. It preserved chronology with indifference to reputation. Ethan Caldwell's influence, formidable in curated spaces, held no authority within these systems. His name appeared only where relevant, stripped of status, reduced to association. The shift was subtle but decisive. Control over narrative moved away from personal interpretation toward institutional fact. This transfer of authority altered the balance entirely. Decisions about next steps followed protocol rather than persuasion. Consultations expanded beyond immediate care, incorporating compliance and risk management teams trained to recognize patterns with implications beyond treatment. The language of the process remained neutral, but its direction was unmistakable. What had begun as clinical concern now demanded accountability. From an omniscient perspective, the irony was unmistakable. The very systems Ethan trusted to streamline outcomes had preserved a record of their own resistance to manipulation. Efficiency ensured traceability. Standardization ensured consistency. The mechanisms designed to protect order had become guardians of truth. No single individual initiated the shift. The system did as it was designed to do. Olivia remained unaware of the broader implications while receiving care grounded in transparency and attention. Her experience within the hospital contrasted sharply with the controlled environment she had left behind. Decisions were explained, options presented, and her consent centered. The difference was not theatrical. It was structural. Care replaced management. Listening replaced assumption. As records were cross-referenced, administrative protocols activated quietly. Compliance frameworks required escalation when cumulative risk thresholds were met. The process did not accuse. It prepared. Documentation was secured, timelines preserved, and oversight engaged. The hospital's responsibility extended beyond immediate treatment to safeguarding patient welfare against systemic harm. That responsibility was non-negotiable. The narrative control Ethan once exercised through precision and authority eroded with each verified entry. The truth did not rely on testimony or confrontation. It existed independently, embedded in timestamps and annotations. The more thoroughly the records were examined, the less room remained for reinterpretation. Patterns, once visible, could not be unseen. By the end of the review, the implications extended beyond medicine. What began as an effort to understand a patient's condition had exposed a structure of influence incompatible with care. The hospital's role evolved accordingly, guided by ethics rather than discretion. The transition was seamless, almost quiet, yet profound. What began as medical concern was now approaching legal inevitability. For the first time in his life, Ethan discovered that influence has limits. The realization did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It unfolded quietly, through unanswered calls, deferred responses, and a noticeable shift in tone from institutions that once moved quickly at his request. The certainty that money could smooth every obstacle began to erode, replaced by an unfamiliar resistance that did not announce itself, but persisted with calm consistency. Ethan's first instinct was to regain narrative dominance. He approached the situation as he would a market disruption, assuming control could be reasserted through precision and leverage. Advisors were consulted, communications drafted, and inquiries framed as clarifications rather than challenges. He expected cooperation or at least discretion. Instead, he encountered adherence to process. Requests were acknowledged but not expedited. Information was shared selectively, guided by protocol rather than preference. The system did not reject him outright. It simply refused to prioritize him. Institutional resistance revealed itself in subtle ways. Meetings were postponed pending review. Documentation was requested in standardized formats, stripping context of persuasion. Decisions were deferred to committees rather than individuals, diffusing influence across layers designed to prevent exactly the kind of interference Ethan relied upon. The absence of confrontation made the resistance more effective. There was nothing to argue against, no person to pressure. The structure itself held firm. The system's refusal to bend unsettled him more than open opposition would have. Ethan was accustomed to obedience, to environments where authority aligned with his expectations. Here, authority was procedural, not personal. Ethics frameworks and compliance requirements dictated outcomes, leaving no room for negotiation. The neutrality of the response exposed a vulnerability he had never confronted. Control, he realized, depended on consent, and consent was not guaranteed. As days passed, the emotional unraveling began. Confidence gave way to irritation, then to something sharper. Ethan's internal narrative shifted from certainty to suspicion. He questioned motives, searched for points of failure, and attempted to identify individuals who could be influenced. Each attempt reinforced the same conclusion. The process was designed to outlast pressure. His frustration deepened as familiar strategies proved ineffective. Rage replaced confidence not in outward displays, but in private recalibration. Ethan's thoughts narrowed, circling the loss of control rather than the implications of the truth emerging beyond him. The idea that documentation could outweigh reputation challenged the foundation of his self-image. He had built his life on the assumption that preparation and power ensured dominance. Now, preparation had preserved evidence and power had become irrelevant. From an omniscient perspective, the shift was inevitable. Systems created to protect integrity are resistant by design. They do not respond to urgency framed as importance. They respond to criteria. Ethan's attempts to reshape the narrative clashed with an environment that valued consistency over exception. Each interaction reinforced the same message. Influence did not extend here. The emotional toll manifested in subtle behavioral changes. Sleep became fragmented, focus inconsistent. The polished calm he presented publicly required increasing effort to maintain. In private, his certainty fractured into anger at circumstances he could not command. The absence of immediate resolution intensified his agitation. He was accustomed to outcomes, not waiting. Meanwhile, the institutional process continued without acknowledgement of his internal struggle. Reviews progressed, documentation expanded, and oversight deepened. The lack of spectacle did not diminish the severity of the situation. If anything, it amplified it. The truth advanced methodically, unimpeded by distraction or intimidation. Ethan's wealth, once a tool of acceleration, now functioned as a reminder of limits. As pressure mounted, Ethan confronted a reality he had long avoided. Systems outlast individuals. His authority, formidable within controlled environments, dissolved within structures built to ensure accountability. The narrative was no longer his to manage. It existed independently, shaped by records and patterns rather than interpretation. The isolation that followed was profound. Advisors spoke carefully, distancing themselves from definitive statements. Allies grew cautious, their support conditional rather than assured. The network that once reinforced his dominance recalibrated in response to uncertainty. Ethan found himself navigating a space where loyalty deferred to self-preservation. Yet, even as institutional exposure loomed, it was not the most devastating threat. The erosion of control revealed something closer, more personal. The implications extended beyond reputation and influence, reaching into relationships he had assumed were static. The structures he relied upon were not the only ones shifting. The personal consequences of his choices began to surface with an immediacy he could not deflect. But the most devastating exposure was not institutional, it was personal. The image Ethan spent decades constructing collapsed in a matter of hours. It did not fall with spectacle or accusation, but with a quiet inevitability that left no room for reinterpretation. The narrative he had curated so carefully began to fracture as verified information replaced assumption. Public and private realities, once separated by wealth and discretion, collided without warning. What emerged was not a scandal driven by rumor, but a reassessment grounded in documented patterns and institutional acknowledgement. The shift in perception began subtly. Questions replaced praise, and silence replaced certainty. Media narratives adjusted their tone, moving from admiration to scrutiny without theatrics. Analysts and commentators noted the change without embellishment, framing it as a reassessment rather than an attack. The absence of dramatic claims made the transformation more credible. Ethan's public image, once reinforced by consistency and control, now appeared brittle under examination. As details surfaced through formal channels, the contrast between Ethan's reputation and the documented reality became impossible to ignore. His philanthropy, once seen as evidence of character, was reevaluated through a different lens. Acts of generosity no longer insulated him from judgment. They were contextualized within a broader pattern of control. The separation between his public persona and private conduct dissolved, revealing a coherence he had not intended. Social perception reversed with a speed that surprised even those accustomed to reputational volatility. Allies distanced themselves cautiously, reframing associations as historical rather than current. Invitations were reconsidered, endorsements quietly withdrawn. The networks that once amplified Ethan's influence recalibrated to protect themselves from association with uncertainty. Wealth no longer guaranteed alignment. Moral discomfort began to outweigh financial incentive. In this reversal, Olivia's survival assumed a new significance. Her presence, once minimized and managed, was reframed as quiet strength. Without spectacle or declaration, her endurance became symbolic. Observers noted the contrast between her restraint and Ethan's unraveling authority. She did not need to assert herself publicly. The facts surrounding her experience spoke with clarity. The narrative shifted away from conflict and toward consequence. Ethan's isolation became complete not through exclusion, but through recalibration. Conversations grew formal, measured, and distant. The familiarity he once commanded dissolved into professionalism devoid of loyalty. Advisors offered cautious language rather than reassurance. The sense of command he had relied upon eroded as decision-makers deferred to ethics and risk rather than relationship. The world he navigated began to feel unfamiliar, governed by standards he could not negotiate. Moral judgment overtook wealth in public discourse. The discussion no longer centered on success metrics or financial achievement, but on responsibility and accountability. The question was no longer whether Ethan had built an empire, but how he had exercised power within it. The reframing was decisive. Wealth, once a shield, became incidental. Character, once assumed, became interrogated. From an omniscient perspective, the collapse was not abrupt. It was cumulative. Each documented choice, each verified pattern, contributed to a reassessment that could not be undone. The absence of dramatic confrontation made the outcome more enduring. This was not a temporary scandal. It was a structural redefinition of identity. Ethan's name no longer carried the same meaning. The certainty he relied upon evaporated, replaced by ambiguity he could not resolve. The internal impact mirrored the external shift. Ethan's confidence fractured into defensiveness, then into silence. He withdrew from public view not out of strategy, but necessity. The performance of control became unsustainable when belief in it waned. He confronted a reality where authority did not follow him automatically, where presence did not command respect. The isolation was not imposed. It was the natural consequence of lost credibility. Meanwhile, Olivia's position stabilized in ways that did not seek attention. Her recovery progressed within systems that prioritized care over management. The narrative surrounding her remained measured, focused on resilience rather than drama. This restraint reinforced her credibility. In contrast to Ethan's diminishing authority, her quiet endurance resonated. The imbalance that once defined their relationship reversed, not through confrontation, but through consequence. Public discourse continued to evolve, guided by verified information rather than speculation. The absence of sensationalism ensured longevity. Ethan's image did not collapse under attack. It dissolved under clarity. The difference mattered. Clarity invited reflection rather than outrage, making the reassessment more permanent. The story was no longer about conflict, but about accountability. As the dust settled, one truth remained unresolved. Beneath the reputational collapse and shifting perceptions lay a deeper implication that had yet to surface fully. The public narrative addressed consequence, but not origin. The question of intent, of what had motivated the system of control now exposed, lingered unanswered. It was this unresolved element that carried the greatest weight. Yet one final truth remained, one that would redefine everything. Power was never about money, it was about who survives the truth. By the time the final implications surfaced, the storm that began the unraveling felt distant, almost symbolic. What remained was clarity, steady and unavoidable. Olivia's journey reached a resolution not through confrontation or spectacle, but through endurance and systems that finally centered her well-being. The outcome did not announce victory, it established balance. In a narrative long governed by control, survival itself became the statement. Olivia's recovery unfolded within structures that prioritized care over management. Decisions were explained, consent was respected, and her needs were addressed without negotiation. This shift marked a profound contrast to the life she had known. Stability returned gradually, not as luxury but as reliability. Each day reinforced the reality that safety did not require permission. The environment around her acknowledged complexity without diminishing her agency, allowing her to reclaim authorship over her own life. Motherhood emerged as a form of resistance without performance. Olivia did not frame it as defiance, yet it reshaped her understanding of strength. The presence of the child redefined priority, grounding her choices in continuity rather than accommodation. Parenthood did not restore what had been lost. It redirected what remained. The future was no longer measured against expectations imposed by power, but against the responsibility to protect and nurture. In that reframing, endurance transformed into purpose. Ethan's loss of control proved irreversible not because of punishment, but because authority requires legitimacy to persist. Once the narrative shifted to accountability, dominance lost its foundation. Systems that once responded to influence now responded to criteria. His attempts to reassert relevance met consistent neutrality. The absence of spectacle underscored the permanence of the change. Control, once surrendered to documentation and ethics, did not return through insistence. Accountability replaced dominance through process rather than declaration. Reviews concluded, frameworks applied, and outcomes followed predictably. The transition was not personal. It was structural. What Ethan experienced was not retaliation, but recalibration. The environment no longer aligned around him, and without alignment, power became symbolic rather than effective. The realization settled slowly, reshaping his understanding of influence as something contingent rather than inherent. From an omniscient perspective, the resolution carried a universality that extended beyond individuals. The narrative demonstrated how systems, when functioning as intended, can correct imbalances without adopting the language of conflict. Accountability did not require humiliation. It required consistency. The shift illustrated that authority unexamined is temporary, while responsibility sustained becomes permanent. The outcome did not elevate one person above another. It reestablished proportion. Olivia's future stabilized within this recalibrated landscape. She did not seek validation from the public reassessment that surrounded Ethan. Her focus narrowed to continuity, health, and autonomy. The absence of spectacle preserved her credibility. Her strength manifested through restraint, through the decision to prioritize life rather than legacy. The child represented not leverage, but renewal. In choosing care over control, she secured something more durable than victory. Ethan's presence receded from public relevance without erasure. His achievements remained documented, but they no longer defined him exclusively. The narrative expanded to include consequence. This inclusion altered interpretation without denying history. Wealth persisted, but it no longer commanded deference. The recalibration did not erase his influence. It contextualized it. In that context, authority became conditional, bound to accountability rather than perception. The broader message emerged without moral instruction. Power, stripped of legitimacy, reveals its limits. Parenthood, grounded in responsibility, reveals resilience. Accountability, applied consistently, restores balance without spectacle. The story did not argue these points. It demonstrated them through outcome. The absence of dramatic resolution reinforced credibility. Truth, once documented, required no amplification. As time progressed, the immediacy of events softened, but their implications endured. Olivia's life continued within systems that acknowledged her agency. Ethan's world adjusted to constraints he could not negotiate. The distance between them became permanent, defined not by hostility but by divergent realities. One moved forward through care and continuity. The other confronted limits imposed by structure. The narrative closed without finality, leaving impact rather than instruction. The truth did not seek revenge or vindication. It remained embedded in records, practices, and outcomes. Power faded where it could not adapt. Responsibility endured where it was accepted. The balance achieved did not announce itself. It persisted quietly, shaping futures without spectacle. Some truths do not seek revenge. They simply remain long after power disappears. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see power and responsibility differently, then it was worth telling. Stories like this survive only when thoughtful viewers keep them alive by sharing, supporting, and staying connected. If you value stories that reveal truth without noise, this channel is built for you. So here's the question that lingers. When power is tested by truth, do you think accountability always arrives, or only when someone finally pays attention?